Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and oh my god, I am so lucky to get to share with you today this incredibly well-made, gorgeous, highly coveted, really hard to come by, and very expensive custom knife from Kody Eutsler. This is the DUKling. Now, we'll talk all about who that is and the history of this knife in just a moment, but this is definitely going to be a small details overview, not a full review, because this is a very expensive knife and it's a loaner, so I have done absolutely no cutting with this knife. We'll talk all about the edge geometry and the blade geometry and talk about how I think it would behave as a cutter, but yeah, going with that caveat, which is a good segue into thank you so much to my friend Lowell for sending this my way to check out. It's been such an incredibly cool experience getting to play with this thing and look at all of the little small detail nerdery going on here. Now, it also took me a really long time to film this because of just stuff going on in my personal life, so also just huge thank you for the patience. It has been a pleasure though. Right, okay, so I said this is a custom knife by a guy named Kody Eutsler. He's a pretty young maker. I think he's just in his mid-20s, 25, 26, something like that. And he's been doing this, though, since 2015, which means he's been doing this, I think, since he was like 19 or 20 years old. He's from, self-described as the Ozarks. I think he's from Missouri, and early on, his earlier models, things like the equalizer, regulator, neutralizer, those names kind of all blur together in my head. I believe that those were what you would call fully handmade knives, in the sense that he's using tools and he's even using a mill, but it's a hand-controlled mill. It's not computer-controlled. I don't think he switched into using CNC until 2018, and it's obvious that that's what he's employing here, because look at this gorgeous milling pattern. Now, the milling pattern is actually going to cause a problem. There's one I would consider fatal flaw with at least this knife, this like implementation in the ones that are styles like this. And we'll talk all about that when we get to the clip. But yeah, he started with CNC, I think around 2018. And these days there's been a lot of different versions in this kind of duck family. The original knife was called the DUK, and it was actually called the DUK. It was the D.U.K. for daily utility knife, and it came out in October of 2018, and it was a 3.5-inch version of basically the same general style. The biggest difference, aside from just the blade length, is that the blade itself didn't have this distinct Tanto-esque shape here. It was just more of a standard draw point. And as a result, I kind of put it in what I call like the Sebenza-esque family of high-end knives that a lot of custom knife makers have done. Things that have a relatively long flat part with a drop point, a thumb ramp, and then a slope down to the tip. There's a lot of knives that fall into that, and it's a very iconic shape. And it makes sense because it's a gorgeous shape. Partly we just are all used to seeing it from CRK, but partly it's just, yeah, it's a beautiful shape for a knife. When he introduced the DUKling in January of 2020, one of the things he did is he moved the lockbar relief internal. We'll talk about that. He changed the clip design some. The clip, we'll talk about that too. But the other thing he did is he switched to having this kind of Tanto-esque shape here. Now, this is not a distinct Tanto where there's different grinds here, but there is clearly a transition point for the edge grind. Now, it's worth noting, though, that eventually changed. We'll talk about that in just a moment, too. Ever since the DUKling came out, he has started having kind of fun with the name, too, because he went from D.U.K., pronouncing it Duke, to making a smaller one and calling it DUKling. Then he, in August of 2020, came up with a front flipper. Now, it's a totally different style of knife, but he called it a front flipper utility knife, and he called that the F.U.K. or FUK. So in May of 2021, coming back to this general shape, he made the DUK Hunter, a fixed blade version. And then finally, if you look at these and you find these, try to find these in a second day, you'll find a lot of people talking about them being like a DUKling V2. Now, I couldn't find a distinct specific transition point when the V2 came out. I think it was around November 2021 though, because the biggest difference between the V1 and V2 that I can discern is that in the V2 he introduced the steel lockbar insert. I've been told that there's subtle blade geometry differences too, and geometry differences in general, but I can't really find a clear explanation of what they are. It's also around the same time they started introducing other blade steels like Magna Gut. Otherwise, he was using CPM 154, I think, and I think that's what this blade is in. I could be wrong. Now, at some point, I don't ever seen anyone call it a V3, but in June of 2022, he changed the blade again, and the newest versions of the DUKlings don't have this distinct point anymore. It has one smooth transition, more similar to a full-size DUK, and that puts it in the more standard, kind of like I said, Sebenza-esque blade shape. I think these are all gorgeous knives, and that connection to the kind of Sebenza shape is why you find some people describe this as like the custom bearing version of Sebenza that so many people wish that there was. It's not. It's certainly a distinct knife, but a lot of people, like, you'll find people like Jake, Bearded Gear, ranting about how the Sebenza feels like it's a relic of the past when it comes to modern knife features that people want in a knife, like this kind of insane, gorgeous action. So there's just things about this that make people think of this kind of and talk about it kind of as if it is like the modern version of what people wish a really high-end Sebenza was. So I want to start off talking about this knife, talking about the aesthetics, because like I was just saying, this falls under that kind of Sebenza shaped thing, but to me, this is just an absolutely stunning, beautiful, beautiful knife. The lines here are so good. Everything is just so well thought out and has such good balance and geometry. There's a lot of different handle patterns, but this one here with these swoops like this, oh man, it's just stunning. I really, really love it. But in particular, there's some next level geometry going on up here. I'm going to tell you what I'm talking about here. So one of my biggest pet peeves on knives is when there's this big gap right here between the blade and the handle. It's one of the things that it really kind of bugs me about, like the bug out, for example. It's mostly just an aesthetic thing. Technically speaking, you could catch this on your pocket as you're putting it in. Most people say that that's never happened to them. It's never happened to me either. That's mostly just like a possibility kind of concern. It's mostly just an aesthetic thing. Now, if you'll find things though, even on really, really like aesthetically thought out, gorgeous high-end custom pieces. Like this is the Herman Vespertilio, and this little tiny nook here, the fact that this doesn't line up flush aesthetically bugs the crap out of me. Now, on designers that are known for having a really high attention to design detail, like this is the F5.5 from Urban EC Supply and designed by Jesper Voxnaes, you'll find it's not uncommon to find things like this little kind of transition here, where this perfectly follows that arc. But even on something like this, it's, there's nothing going on here. Like this doesn't not hit, but nothing fills in this spot. And in the closed position, there's just kind of open spaces everywhere. What's going on here is incredible. So what I'm talking about is the way that these curves follow here and these curves follow here in both positions. He's made it so that this shape here, this curve here, matches this slope here, so that this lines up in the closed position, but also perfectly lines up here in the open position. This is one smooth, seamless little arc. Similarly, this lines up here in the closed position, follows this curve perfectly, but then that mirrors this down here in a way that lines up and is a smooth, seamless transition here. Making those things balance and line up in both the open and closed position is insane. I honestly don't think I've seen that on any other knife. That is such an incredible attention to detail, and it means that the knife just feels so incredibly fluid and well thought out. Your fingers can just kind of roll over this, and there's no sharp corners anywhere. Everything lines up, even in this open and closed position. I'm seriously, it's a small detail, but that kind of stuff blows me away. Let's start talking about this blade. So we've got on the full-size DUK, you've got a 3.5-inch blade. Now on this DUKling, you have just under 3. It's 2.995. This sharpened blade length, though, is only 2.75 because you've got this thing here that is a sharpening choil, but can also be used as a finger choil. It's not a huge finger choil, but it's certainly enough for you if you kind of curl around this spot and only putting part of your finger in that area. And you can see that they've knocked this corner back, so there's nothing to puncture you there. This part back here is 1.375 inches of perfectly flat. So if you're wanting to do kind of chopping or anything that would benefit benefit from a flat surface, you've got that, and then a pronounced belly. And like I said, on these versions, the majority of DUKlings that are out there in existence, there is a distinct corner right there, which means that you can use these for the way you would any kind of tanto, where you can use this as a second piercing surface if you're just cutting along the blade, the top of a box and you want to puncture with tape or something like that. So aesthetically and from a sharpening perspective, I don't like tantos as much, and so I'm glad to see that he has dropped this little transition point here on the newest versions, but functionally, they technically give you a little bit more benefit. Now this is a 0.1375 inch blade stock, and so that's a pretty standard size. It's not very thin, and so this is not like the thinnest blade, but it's not so thick that you can't push through cardboard or anything like that. This is a full 0.373 inch grind right here, and it is a flat grind. So this is coming down to about 15 thousandths behind the edge. And so this is a long enough transition here that even though this blade stock is not crazy thin, I think that this would push through cardboard perfectly fine. Again, I have not personally done with it because not my knife. Now, also, this tip, you can see that the swedge here is dropping technically below this grind line, and the grind line here is swooping up at the end, which is how we're able to keep this edge about the same thickness the entire way. But it means that this tip is not a dainty tip. It looks dainty because of the way that this wedge is giving you this top transition that's just thin right there. But if I put my fingers to show you like the full width of this as you're coming down, it actually has a good amount of meat behind it. But it's still thin and precise enough that I fully expect that you would be able to do some pretty detailed cutting around stuff or get into small corners. It has enough of like a thin part right here that you can definitely get into small compact spaces. And it also means that you don't have to lift your hand all that much to get to this edge. When a knife has a lot of belly at the end, it means that you often will have to roll up around that belly in order to get to the tip. But when this is flat in this dimension, rather than being really rounded out like that, you don't have to curl up as far because you can get to the tip right about there instead of having to come all the way up to there. So while I have not personally cut with this knife, everything about this geometry makes me think this is going to be a perfectly satisfactory slicer. It's not going to be the thinnest, sliciest knife in the world, but it's also going to be robust enough that I don't think you're going to have to worry about it at all. It's going to be it's as designed, it's a daily utility knife, so I think this is kind of a general all-arounder blade. And then one of the things I would like to see be slightly better is this plunge grind. Now, what I mean here is that the plunge is the transition from the full thickness up here to the thinnest behind the edge, and you can see that this is one continuous arc, and from what I can tell, it's kind of hard to see on this blade finish, but I think it's ending right basically at the edge. I don't think it's really coming out at all. And if you look, there is a very, very slight smile already. So the more that you sharpen this going up, you're going to be increasing the size of that smile as you go up and up this thicker and thicker spot. So if he could pull this in to be a tighter plunge, I would love to see that. Now, like I said, this spot does work totally fine as a finger choil. Now, it's not the kind of thing where your finger rests entirely in the choil. You're going to be curled up around the spot. But as I said, this is all filled in right here. And so resting your finger in this position feels fantastic, especially if you're countering against this thumb ramp right there. I love the way it feels in my hand in this position. Now, there is no jimping along this spine, so this thumb ramp is the kind of thing that you're pushing against just from a geometry perspective. I've not done any cutting with this, like I said, but I don't find that I don't feel my hands slipping at all or anything like that when I try to push down and put a lot of force behind this, when I emulate what that would be like. Similarly, the blade spine, even though it is coming up like this with this swedge and is kind of thin, it's a shallow enough slope that it actually kind of feels almost like a crown spine when you're putting your finger on it. And so it's actually quite comfortable to rest your finger along this spine and try to put force. So this is the kind of grip I would use if I'm using this tip or if I'm using this secondary tip there to cut along the top of a box. Now moving back, let's talk about these handles. I think this is just such a well thought out handle. There are such beautiful and ergonomic curves everywhere. They're in these delightful little slopes. Nothing is sharp, nothing is pointy, and everything just feels like it locks into your hand. There is this nice scallop here in the handle for your finger to rest into, and then there's this ever so slight subtle curve back up here that means that it feels like you've got indexing points, like you can tell where your fingers are locking in. If you choke up and you switch all your fingers up some, and it just feels so good. This curve back here rests into your hand in a really, really pleasant way in that kind of pinch grip. And if you choke back even further, All of these transitions back here are nice and smooth and rounded off. Nothing anywhere is sharp. Everything feels so locked in. These handles themselves are pretty thin. These are 0.440, so it's a reasonably thin knife. And the entire thing is contours. The kind of contouring that is biased towards the top. So like this part is significantly thicker than it is down here, but there's a nice slope as you go. And so as a result, this just feels so pleasant in my hand. Everything just rounds off in such a nice way, and all of these edges are so beautifully radiused. I can't get over how good this feels in my hand. Absolutely love it. Coming along the back of the spine, we have this full backspacer, and it wraps around this entire way, and it has these kind of subtle jimping points on it. Now this is flush enough with the knife that it's not going to be like sharp transitions or sharp rough texture as you go, but it is enough that it actually does provide subtle, but there, additional grip right there. So if I slide right here, slidey, slide right here, grippier. And it wraps around like the bottom, like I said. So if you are trying to put a lot of force into a push cut, you've got this anchored in the back with this extra little bit of grip. I absolutely love that. This particular one has a milling pattern on it that is like a radius coming out from the pivot. I think it looks really, really nice. And you can see that on the outside, there's additional radiuses that are at a higher angle. I think it's aesthetically is such a beautiful version. There's also versions with chevrons, and there's versions with all sorts of stuff. He's done things that are completely flat and smooth. All sorts of stuff. There's versions of this knife that are done as an inset liner lock, and there's versions that are done as a bolster lock. So there's a lot of variations. This particular one is a full frame lock, and so there's something I want to show that he's doing that is really, really cool. So normally, if you have a frame lock knife, like this is Tucson TS121 or something like that, you're going to have a big cutout right here for the lockbar relief. Now in some knives, like the TW Price Dawn, they've moved that lockbar relief to the inside, and aesthetically it is a much cleaner look. I really like to see that, but one of the consequences is now you have this gap showing up from above. What Kody has done here is made that entirely invisible. This knife is wildly skeletonized inside. If you look at all those milling pockets, oof, they are everywhere, and they're so deep, and he's done it on both sides. And right here, can we see that? This is the internal lockbar relief, but what you can see is that he's actually left the full thickness of the material right here just along the top. Now, if you think about it, like if you imagine why is an I-beam in construction stronger than if they just had a slab, that 90-degree angle does add additional structural support. And what that means is that leaving that on right there does make it so this is a firmer lock bar. This is going to be harder to bend because of that remaining material. Because it's such a small amount right there, this is still a pretty easy to push over lock bar. I suspect that if he had taken this part out and made it a more traditional internal lockbar relief, that this would be a very light lockbar given the depth that is, and this would be a completely free fall of its own weight knife. As is, there's some enough force on this that this does close, it does require some swinging to close. We'll talk all about that more in the action, but the aesthetic here is just gorgeous, and it means that as you're pushing your fingers against this, there's nowhere to catch on. There's nothing gets to snag on your pocket, there's nothing to catch your finger on, it just feels so good. Another next level detail is you can see he's done the exact same thing up here for the internal lock bar insert. Now he's not the only person that does this, but oftentimes you'll see the lock bar insert just sticking off the top right there. It's a pretty darn common to see that, but here it's hidden entirely between this little lip right there. And as a result, if you look at this from above, there's just one smooth, seamless transition this whole way, and it is, again, that is some next level details. Now that internal weight relief puts this at only 3.316 ounces, and now I said that's a 2.995 inch blade, and so technically this is over the ounce and inch mark, but this is so skeletonized, I don't think you could ever really get this much lower, and the balance point on this is exactly where you'd want it to be, in the standard grip where your forefingers falling right there, and so as a result, this feels light and it feels really nimble. I am very impressed with the balance and skeletonization on that. Continuing the theme of things being pretty seamless, there is an internal clip attachment right here. And it's done in a really interesting way. Now, I personally am surprised that these screws are on this side and not on this side. I think it would make more sense to put all of the screws on this side, since you're going to have one here as well, and make it so this entire front is completely smooth and sterile, but he didn't. But there is no screw right there. And this screw right there is not the screw holding this in. That's coming into this back part right here. There's actually 2 screws that are right inside here holding this in. And it's not that wide, so it's surprising me they're able to fit in 2. I haven't taken this knife apart, but Lowell sent me a disassembly picture that he himself took, and I'll pop that in. As far as lockbar access goes, you've got a scallop on both sides of this, and so you have a pretty good amount of space there. There's no like recession of this show side, and so it's just those scallops, but I have never had any trouble getting my fingers in here to push this over. I find that it is a tremendously easy to unlock knife. Now, he has offered a lot of different handle scale finishes. This particular one has like a dark stonewash, but in general, everything is just really, really well done. Like I said, there are no sharp corners absolutely anywhere. There are tiny little radiuses and chamfers along every single surface. All of this is such a nice smooth transition. I can't find a single sharp thing on this. Similarly, the blade finishes come in a lot of different forms. And this is, I don't know what he calls this, but it's like, I would say a dark stonewash of some kind, like not a full black wash, but a darkened blade of some kind. But there are still pronounced grind lines there. And I think it's a really, really cool aesthetic. I have no idea how well this finish holds up to use, but man, does it look gorgeous. I suspect that it will probably show scratches if they are sharp and bright, but for the most part, this is a rough enough aesthetic that I think most scratches would probably be covered up just fine. The last small detail I want to explain about the handle is there's just little transitions everywhere that he's doing. Like you can see that the milling here actually comes up and raises up to meet where this pivot is. I think this pivot, well, actually, I don't know. This pivot to me looks like it's from Tie Connector, but he might be making it himself, because I thought these were from Tie Connector as well, but these are actually something he's making himself as well. So it's possible that this is an in-house pivot. But I love the way that the handle slopes up like this to match it. I think it's just a great little next level detail. And you can see that he's doing the same thing here on the back around this screw. And so there's no sharp corners or transitions absolutely anywhere. But now we need to talk about the one thing that I think, at least on this particular knife and this particular milling pattern, is a fatal flaw. And it's this clip. Okay, so in the original Duck had what I would consider a comically large clip. It looks kind of silly to me, honestly. And so one of the things that he did with the DUKling is he shortened it and did a whole new clip design. And so from an aesthetic perspective, I think it looks really, really nice. And from an ergonomic perspective, I don't notice this at all. I honestly cannot feel this clip. I was a little bit surprised to find that because it does slightly extend up past this line. And I normally find that if anything extends up past this and sticks into the ball up here, I'll feel it, but I just don't. I also thought that it might be jabby because of how small it gets, but again, it just isn't. I've done a lot of wiggling this around in my hand to see if it's gonna rub anywhere, and it just doesn't. This clip feels fantastic. The problem is getting this in and out of your pocket. Okay, so the clearance here is just not very high. It's just thin enough that it's going to snag on thicker pants. But the bigger thing is this part here. He's made the contact surface, let me get a brighter surface. He's made the contact surface of the clip really long. It extends from here all the way back to here. And there's a great slope on either side of it to make it slide in and out, except there's a lot of surface contact with this very aggressive milling texture that is perfectly against the direction of motion. And so then you combine that with the fact that there's that extended contact surface means that there's a relatively short, thin part back here, means that this is not a very flexible clip at all. And it's hard to get it to flex enough that the back part is actually pulling away from that milling pattern. And so I find that the combination of this large contact surface, inflexible clip, and milling pattern makes this just an absolute chore to get in and out of the pocket. Like to the point where it's actively unpleasant trying to take this in and out. I suspect that if you get one of the versions that is a smooth pattern or just has the milling, like the radial burst one that he does has the milling patterns going in this direction, the direction you're sliding, it's probably a non-issue. But even then, I would still want significantly more spring tension and just a wider spot up here. But as is, it is difficult enough that I find it to be an absolute deal breaker for this particular style. I would not buy a DUKling with this milling pattern because of how annoying I found it to be in and out of my pocket. But hey, if you're the type of person that is buying it just to, play with or just to admire because of its extreme gorgeousness, maybe you're not sticking it out of your pocket and maybe that's a moot point for you. And he could, of course, solve this even with this milling pattern by just milling a flat pad underneath where the clip mounts. Again, still would like more tension, spring tension there, but having a flat pad there would largely solve that problem. As far as carry goes, this is actually an exceptionally deep carry clip for a milled tie clip. Actually, just in general, you've got, this much sticking out of your pocket? That's really, really good. Okay, let's talk about the action because this knife is a dream to play with. I love the sensation of opening this up. It has such an incredibly delightful poppy detent. It just pops right out. And the positioning of this thumb stud and this curve here means that you can just kind of follow this curve upward and push out like that, and it just pops with this delightful kind of follow through. Part of that is the weight of the blade is enough that, you know how sometimes when you open a knife, you can tell that it's going to open all the way? And I don't mean like, of course it's going to open and you just know it from experience kind of thing. I mean like you can feel the momentum of the blade going and it has this sense of follow through that like you can feel it swinging. That's what this knife does. And on the close, I love it. Okay, so these thumb studs, like I said before, I thought originally when I looked at them that they were from Tie Connector, but they're not. These are something he apparently makes in-house, and they are so gorgeous. In fact, I'm gonna go out on a limb to say that this is effectively a perfect thumb stud. I love this thumb stud. The stepping pattern on the top gives you fantastic traction, and the slight little flowery lobed pattern on the outside means that if you're coming from the side like this, you get grip even on the side. I love this. He does sell these thumb studs separately on his website, and he sells them in zirconium as well. I don't know if they're a standard thickness or bar. I don't know how you would attach. Maybe I don't know if you can attach them to other knives. He might just be selling them if you want to swap zirc onto one of your existing DUKlings or something like that. But they're a good enough thumb stud that it's worth getting for trying on a different knife. The positioning here is just perfect for that. Even on the reverse flick, you can see that you have plenty of access in the back. I find opening this knife to be an absolute dream. The one caveat is that this knife is susceptible to lockbar pressure. Now, it's a small enough lockbar here. That's one of the things I really love is that it's like less than a third of the overall space here. So it's not hard for me to keep my fingers off of it, but if I do accidentally put my finger on that, it's possible for me to lock that up in a way that it's harder, but I very rarely have ever failed this knife because this grips so well against my thumb. As far as closing goes, this is the kind of knife that doesn't free fall. It stays where you put it, but any amount of swinging in the slightest, like it's not even micro shake, it's just like, it's closing. It's a really cool sensation. If you have this pivot tuned just perfectly, it'll even do the thing where if you put it at this angle, it will just slowly fall down of its own accord over the course of 45 seconds or something like that. But as is the kind of thing where any subtle amount of closing and it just pops home. This is one of my favorite kind of actions on a knife because I don't worry about it hitting me, but it's so tremendously easy and satisfying feeling to close. You can absolutely make it fall to your thumb. Part of what's going on here is that this little nub right here, if you have your thumb up high enough, that will catch you. But if you have it back, it'll fall like this. And so at least if you're doing the way I always do, where I have my thumb pointed upward, it's going to fall into this little nook right there. And so there's no risk of it hitting your thumb. I think if you were to come in like this at an angle, then it would come down. And so maybe that would hit you, but I never close my knives that way. The other thing is that it's pleasant enough to close this that I often just will put this up like that and make that fall. He's also done a tremendous job with the detent ball placement on this. This is a very, very early detent engagement. I measured this as 7 degrees, and that's better than most knives, period. But then there's also a very subtle detent ball ramp. So it's enough that it's the kind of detent ball ramp where you do have to push up onto it, but it ends, I honestly can't tell where it ends. It might end like almost immediately. And so it's the kind of thing where if you are just trying to push this home with your thumb, it is so tremendously easy to get up on here. And it's so quick to get up to past the detent ball that I have never once been caught by the detent ball. It is like a perfect implementation there. Now there's something else about the action that I want to point out here, and it's the sound when it closes. Here, let me do it by the mic. Now there's something else I wanted to point out about the way this closes, and that's the sound when it closes. Let me do that up by the mic. There's a kind of a secondary reverberation. What's going on here is that even though in this knife is completely bang faulty with the way I have it right now, as soon as you open up that Lockbar, there's actually a decent amount of pivot lash. What that means is that the hole in the blade that the pivot goes through is larger enough that the blade is allowed to shift around it, and you hear this kind of rattling sound as it bangs against that pivot. And that's exactly what's happening on the close. There's actually two different clicks. I'm going to hold it in a way that it doesn't allow it to close all the way, but it allows you to hear that first click. There's two clicks in a row. That first click is actually the exact same sound you're hearing when I do this. What's going on here is as you close the knife, as soon as the detent ball starts engaging with the detent hole, the moment you cross this top threshold right here, all of that force that was just pushing upward is now going to be slightly pushing off to the side as well. It's going to pull the blade that way. It's going to accelerate the blade down. And so that's actually literally pulling the blade down against that pivot and making that first tapping sound. If you just pull down on the blade as you do this, that sound goes away. Let go. Pull down. And that's just because I'm applying that force myself. I'm preemptively pulling it against the pivot, and so it can't tap into it. Now, pivot lash doesn't really matter. There's no rattle in the closed position. There's no rattle in the open position. It only matters if it becomes a rattly feeling knife while it's closing, and that can make a knife feel cheap. I personally find that on this knife, because of the amount of tension that we have from the Lockbar, that there's no real rattling sensation as it goes. So I don't find this to be a problem whatsoever on this knife, but I know that pivot lash really bothers some people, and especially on a knife in this price point. Personally, I think the sound on the close is cool enough that I honestly prefer it this way. I just love it. So what are my final thoughts? Honestly, I get it. I get the appeal. I get why these are as popular as they are. The secondary prices in these are kind of bonkers. It's not full 2x the way things like the Oz Roosevelt is going, but it's definitely quite inflated still. So I think some people are getting in the lottos just hoping to be able to flip it and make some cash. I don't know if I think it's worth secondary prices, but as far as the standard book pricing, the table price on things I think range from like $900 to $1,200 depending on the materials and configuration. And honestly, I think it is absolutely worth that. The quality of the machining here is so well done, and the design small details are so well thought out. The action is so incredibly fun and pleasant. I think this thing is exceptional. Now, as I said, I personally would avoid this milling pattern until he someday alters this clip attachment, because this definitely needs a flat milled spot underneath, or at least a much springier clip. I would want to have that either way. So if you go for one of the milling patterns that doesn't have that problem, by all means, probably not a problem at all. And now that I've had this in hand for this long, if I can find one that doesn't have that milling pattern right there, yeah, I'm going to be hunting one of these for sure. This is an exceptional knife. So with that, thank you for watching. Huge again thanks to Lowell for sending this my way, and I'll catch you guys next time.